My Safety Training Online presents confined space training for general industry. Welcome. What you will learn. We will define what a confined space is. We'll give a definition of confined space terms. We'll give an option for entering a confined space. What testing of a confined space consists of, the non-entry confined space situations, as well as pre-entry steps for confined space situations. And we'll give a summary of all responsibilities in a checklist. Section 1, Introduction to Confined Spaces. Definition of what a confined space is. It is a space large enough and open enough so that an employee can perform work in it. It has limited or restricted means of exit or entry, and is not designed for continuous human occupancy. What are examples of confined space in industrial or construction situations? Tanks, manholes, boilers, furnaces, sewers, silos, hoppers, vaults, pipes, trenches, tunnels, ducts, bins, and pits. What kinds of hazards could the worker be involved with? Well, thank you for asking. How about oxygen deficiency, toxic materials, nasty animals or insects, as well as mechanical hazards, flooding? Entry is defined as the act of intentionally passing through an opening into a permanent required space. Any part of the body passing through the opening is considered an entry. What kind of confined spaces are there? Permit required entry areas and non-permit required entry areas. IDLH, immediately dangerous to life and health, is any condition which poses an immediate threat to the health of the entrant or would cause irreversible adverse health effects to the life of the entrant. IDLH would interfere with the ability of the entrant to escape unaided from a permit space. An entrant is an employee who physically enters a confined space to perform work. An attendant is defined as an employee who remains outside the confined space while the entrant is inside. Attendants guard the space against unauthorized entry. They warn entrants of unusual conditions and call rescue procedures. Yes, the attendant's job to summon rescue procedure, if needed, is the most important task that they are asked to do. Section 2, Confined Space Permits and Non-Permit Areas. A permit required space is a confined space which has one or more of the following characteristics. It contains or has the potential of hazardous atmosphere. It contains a material that has the potential for engulfing the entrant. A permit required space has the internal configurations such that an entrant can become trapped or asphyxiated. It contains serious health or other safety issues such as dangerous animals or insects, electricity, odors, etc. A permit required space must have specific entrant supervisor before an entrant can be relieved. This employee will be responsible for coordinating the space into the confined space. They must be a supervisor or foreman. The responsible person will be the ultimate management person for the entrance into the confined space. Section 3, Pre-entry procedures for confined spaces. Pre-entry procedures call for isolating the space, ventilating the space, conducting a tailboard meeting, and completing the permit process. Pre-entry procedures call for testing the atmosphere of the space about to be entered and documenting it. Above all the steps, then enter the space with the attendant and the supervisor present. Isolate the hazard, close any valves, double block and bleed if necessary, or blank the flange. Empty the space, depressurize it using a vent and drain procedure. Lock out and tag out of equipment if necessary, such as electrical equipment, rotating reciprocating parts, hazardous materials, as well as clean any residue from the space about to be entered. Conduct a tailboard meeting before the entrance into the permit area. The entire crew must attend: entrance, attendants, and supervisors. Review all the hazards and the work to be completed, documenting everything. When conducting the tailboard meeting, review all the personal protective equipment about to be used, review the procedures for contacting rescue personnel, and verify that they are available. Complete the entry permit while the meeting is ongoing. Complete the permit process. Permit must be completely and fully filled out prior to entry. The permit is activated by the entry supervisor's signature to be valid. No entry is allowed without a valid permit. Permits are valid up to 12 hours. When work is completed, a tailboard form and permit should be returned to the safety person. Canceled permits should be kept on file up to 1 year. Test the atmosphere in this order. Check for oxygen content between 19.5 and 23%. Check for combustibles. They must be less than 10% of their lower explosive limit, or LEL. Check for toxic gases, with the most common, carbon monoxide, having a PEL or permissible exposure limit of less than 35 parts per million, or other hazardous materials as determined by the space. Remember, any time a limit is exceeded, personnel should exit the space, no matter what the reason. No one else should enter the space until safe levels are back to normal. Atmospheric testing shall be performed prior to entry when the space is vacant. After a 10-minute ventilation period, if ventilation is necessary, at least hourly for permit-required confined spaces. More frequent testing when conditions or suspicions warrant. Ventilating the space. Use mechanical ventilation in the form of fans or air horns. Ventilate the space at least 4 volumes per hour, making sure the air supply is not contaminated. Ventilation must be done with fresh air supply uncontaminated by flammable toxins. Welcome to Section 4, Non-Permit Required Confined Spaces. Always test the air at various levels before making any assessment as to the danger that may or may not exist. Good air near the opening does not mean there's good air throughout the confined space. Have the attendant posted near the entry point, who must be in constant contact with the entrant. All entrants should sign in the log and sign out when finished. The entrant shall maintain a sign-in log for the duration of the work. Before entering the space, complete the following activities: isolate the space, ventilate the space, evaluate the space for the following: testing the atmosphere and assuring the justification principles are met, then conducting a tailboard meeting and filling out the documentation, and of course finally entering the space. Steps in isolating a non-permit space: close and double block and bleed valves, blank the flange, empty the space, depressurizing, ventilizing, and draining, conducting lockout, tagout operations on open electrical facilities. Lockout and tagout of electrical means locking out and tagging out, rotating and reciprocating parts, or clean up any residue which is the space which could be hazardous. Determine that the space meets all the requirements of the conditions of a non-permit justification. Conduct atmospheric testing with an evaluation by a certified entry space supervisor. Determine that the confined space does not contain hazardous atmosphere or have the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. Pre-entry evaluation steps should include continuous mechanical ventilation is acceptable. The space does not contain a material with potential for engulfment, and the space does not have the potential for entrapment or asphyxiation or contain a serious safety hazard. If non-permit conditions change during the job, the space should be evacuated and the space should be reclassified as a permit-required space, or conditions shall be recertified by the entry supervisor as a non-permit space. Section 5, Contractor Confined Space Rules. Contractors must be informed in signed-off documentation of the hazards they will encounter. Contractors must follow their own pre-established rules for confined spaces and use their own permit forms. Contractors must supply their own attendants. One will be enough for multiple entrants. Contractors must supply their own air monitors for each space entered. Contractors must review the entry after completion of each job. Attendant responsibilities are as follows. To monitor the job during entry and exit safely, the attendant may not abandon his or her post for any reason unless relieved by another qualified attendant. Responsibilities will include monitoring the atmosphere prior to and during the entry into the space. Responsibilities include access to the confined space, to summon emergency assistance if needed, to assess the hazards in and around the space, plus take action if necessary, to keep records on the confined space such as air monitoring and personnel entry or exit, etc. Section 6, Entrant and Supervisor Responsibilities in Confined Spaces. Responsibilities include the space has been properly ventilated, emptied, isolated, and otherwise made safe for entry. To immediately exit a space upon word from the attendant, no matter what the reason, and to follow all safety rules and procedures that apply to the job. Responsibilities also include being familiar with the job and the procedures to be followed, using the appropriate personal protective equipment whenever necessary. Responsibilities include ensuring the safety of the entrance through verifying adequate lockout procedures have been followed, as well as all the hazards that have been securely isolated in the job site, supporting the attendant's authority in controlling access to the confined space. All are part of the supervisor's responsibilities. Responsibilities include ensuring that all work participants have exited upon completion of the job, assuring that all the workers are aware of the hazards and controls associated with the job, and assuring that rescue services are available prior to the entry. Section 7, Checklist on Confined Space Activities. The Confined Space Checklist. Are all confined spaces thoroughly emptied of any corrosive or hazardous substances such as acids or caustics before entry? All lines to the confined space containing inert, toxic, flammable, or corrosive materials valved off, blanked, or disconnected and separated before entry? Are all impellers, agitators, or other moving parts inside the confined space locked out if they present a hazard? Is either the natural or mechanical ventilation prior to the confined space entry? The confined space checklist also includes, are all appropriate atmospheric tests performed to check for oxygen deficiency, toxic substances, explosive concentrations in the confined space before the entry? Is adequate illumination provided for the work to be performed in the confined space? Is the standby employee appropriately trained and equipped to handle an emergency? Is the atmosphere inside the confined space frequently tested and continuously monitored during the conduct of the work? Is there an assigned safety standby employee outside the confined space when required, whose sole responsibility is to watch the work in progress, sound an alarm if necessary, and render assistance? Is the standby employee appropriately trained and equipped to handle an emergency? Is the standby employee or other employees prohibited from entering the confined space without lifelines, respiratory equipment, if there's any question as to the cause of the emergency? Is the approved respiratory equipment required if the atmosphere inside the confined space cannot be made acceptable? Is all the portable electrical equipment used inside the confined space either grounded or insulated, or equipped with a ground fault protection? Whenever combustion-type equipment is used in a confined space, are provisions made to ensure exhaust gases are vented to the outside of the enclosure? Before gas welding or burning is started in a confined space, are hoses checked for leaks, compressed gas bottles forbidden inside a confined space, torches lighted only outside the confined area, and the confined area tested for explosive atmospheres each time before a lighted torch is taken into the confined space? If employees will be using oxygen-consuming equipment such as salamanders, torches, and furnaces in a confined space, is sufficient air provided to assure combustion without reducing the oxygen content of the atmosphere below 19.5% in volume? Whenever combustion-type equipment is used in a confined space, are provisions made to ensure that exhaust gases are vented outside the enclosure? Is the confined space checklist for decaying vegetation or animal matter which may produce methane? Is the confined space checked for possible industrial waste which could contain toxic properties? If the confined space is below ground and near areas where motor vehicles will be operating, is it possible for vehicle exhaust or carbon monoxide to enter the space? Thanks for participating from the gentle folks of MySafetyTrainingOnline.com.